Most people think Britain lost the American colonies because of a few decisive battles or poor leadership, but the truth is far more complex. The British Empire was the most powerful in the world at the time, yet it failed to hold onto territories it had controlled for over 150 years. And the loss was not just about military defeat, it was about strategy, logistics, politics, and the will of a population determined to govern itself. By the mid-18th century, Britain had the largest empire the world had ever seen. Its navy dominated the seas, and its economy was vast. Controlling 13 colonies across the Atlantic should have been relatively simple. Yet, by 1783, the British had lost them all. Understanding why requires looking beyond battles and generals to the structural weaknesses, logistical nightmares, and ideological conflicts that made the American Revolution far more difficult than Britain anticipated. Before the war, the colonies were not a monolithic entity. They were a collection of economically diverse, geographically separated regions, each with its own interests, cultures, and grievances. London's policymakers often underestimated the degree to which local identity and self-governance had taken root over more than a century. British officials assumed loyalty could be maintained through occasional concessions, displays of military might, and appeals to shared history, but these assumptions were dangerously flawed. The French and Indian War had already stretched Britain's resources. Victory over France left Britain with enormous debts and an empire that was expensive to maintain. To pay for it, Parliament imposed taxes on the colonies, including the infamous Stamp Act and Townshend Acts. While these measures were intended to raise revenue, they also provoked widespread resentment. Colonists felt their rights as Englishmen were being violated, coining the rallying cry "No taxation without representation." The more Britain tried to assert control, the more resistance it provoked. Military strategy also played a crucial role in Britain's failure. British generals were trained to fight conventional European wars in open fields against organized armies. They struggled to adapt to the decentralized, guerrilla-style tactics employed by colonial militias. American forces used the terrain, surprise attacks, and avoidance of direct confrontation to frustrate British operations. Even when the British won battles, they often failed to translate them into lasting strategic gains. Victory on the battlefield did not equal control over the population. Logistics presented another monumental challenge. Supplying an army across the Atlantic was slow, expensive, and vulnerable to disruption. Every troop, cannon, and shipment of provisions took weeks to arrive. Disease, poor weather, and difficult terrain further reduced effectiveness. American forces, by contrast, were fighting close to home and often lived off the land, giving them agility and resilience. Political missteps compounded military difficulties. Britain expected Loyalist support to be widespread and reliable. While many colonists did remain loyal, particularly in urban centers and certain southern regions, the Loyalist base was never as strong as London hoped. British troops often alienated potential supporters by imposing harsh measures, seizing property, and committing abuses. What was intended as a show of authority instead fueled rebellion. International dynamics also tilted the scales. France, eager to avenge its defeat in the 7 Years' War, secretly supplied the colonies with money, weapons, and military advisors long before openly joining the war in 1778. Spain and the Netherlands eventually joined as well, turning the American Revolution into a global conflict. Britain now had to fight on multiple fronts while maintaining overseas colonies elsewhere, further stretching its capabilities. Leadership challenges were another critical factor. British commanders often disagreed on strategy, sometimes pursuing short-term victories without a clear long-term plan. The lack of unity between military and political leadership in London and in the colonies created delays, confusion, and lost opportunities. In contrast, American leadership, particularly under George Washington, emphasized survival, endurance, and the preservation of morale over immediate tactical wins. Washington understood that avoiding catastrophic defeat could ultimately lead to victory, a lesson Britain did not learn. Another underestimated element was ideology. The colonists were motivated not just by fear of taxes or economic disruption, but by the principles of self-governance, liberty, and natural rights. These ideas were powerful motivators, inspiring ordinary men and women to endure hardship, risk their lives, and continue fighting despite setbacks. Britain relied on conventional incentives, pay, orders, and coercion, which were insufficient against a population committed to an abstract but compelling vision of freedom. The turning point came at Yorktown in 1781, where French and American forces combined to trap General Cornwallis's army. While this was the final major military confrontation, the factors leading to British defeat had been building for years: overextended supply lines, underestimated local resistance, divided command, and the growing international support for the colonies. Victory at Yorktown was a culmination, not a cause. By the time the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783, Britain had lost 13 colonies, billions of dollars in revenue, and a portion of its empire. The loss reshaped British imperial policy, prompting a shift in focus to Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean. It also left a lasting legacy in the colonies themselves, demonstrating that organized resistance, combined with international alliances and ideological commitment, could defeat the most powerful empire on earth. The real reason Britain lost the American colonies, therefore, was not a single mistake or a single battle. It was the convergence of strategic misjudgment, logistical challenges, political miscalculations, and the unyielding resolve of a people fighting for principles they believed were worth every risk. The empire underestimated both the determination of the colonists and the power of ideas to motivate a revolution. Britain's failure is a lesson in the limits of power. An empire can have unmatched wealth, military strength, and experience, but without understanding local conditions, respecting political realities, and accounting for human resolve, even the mightiest nations can falter. The American Revolution did not just produce an independent United States, it revealed the vulnerabilities of imperial overreach and the enduring influence of ideology on the course of history. In the end, the British defeat was inevitable once these forces converged. It was a story of hubris, adaptation, and human determination, a story that transformed the world and reshaped global power for generations to come. The loss of the American colonies was not the result of a single failure, it was the outcome of countless miscalculations, challenges, and misunderstandings that, together, spelled the end of Britain's hold over North America. And it serves as a reminder that even the greatest empires can fall when strategy ignores reality and power underestimates principle. The aftermath of Britain's loss also revealed deeper consequences for both sides. In the colonies, victory inspired confidence and a new sense of identity. No longer subjects of a distant crown, Americans began to think of themselves as citizens of a new nation, capable of self-governance and independent action. But independence also brought immediate challenges, creating a functional government, balancing state and national authority, and establishing economic stability in a war-torn land. For Britain, the defeat triggered reflection and reform. Policymakers realized that holding distant colonies required more than military might. They began to examine administrative practices, taxation policies, and the treatment of local populations in other parts of the empire. Lessons learned in America informed British strategies in India, the Caribbean, and Africa. The empire remained powerful, but it became more cautious, recognizing that misjudging local sentiment could be disastrous. Socially and culturally, the loss had ripple effects. Loyalists who had supported Britain often faced persecution or exile. Many fled to Canada, the Caribbean, or back to Britain, spreading British influence elsewhere. Meanwhile, the United States developed a culture that celebrated resistance, self-reliance, and civic participation, values that were, in part, forged in opposition to British authority. The war also changed international perceptions. Britain's reputation as an invincible global power was tarnished, while the American victory inspired revolutions and independence movements worldwide. From France to Latin America, the idea that colonies could successfully challenge an empire became a powerful precedent. This shift marked the beginning of a new era in global politics, where ideas and ideology could rival armies and navies in shaping history. Yet, even after victory, the American colonies faced ongoing struggles. The newly independent states were economically fragile and politically inexperienced. Many of the same principles that helped them resist Britain, local autonomy, distrust of centralized power, and popular mobilization complicated the formation of a stable federal government. The Articles of Confederation initially proved inadequate, and it would take a decade before the Constitution provided a stronger, more unified framework. From the British perspective, the loss became a cautionary tale. It illustrated that empire is not maintained by force alone. Political missteps, underestimation of local resolve, and failure to adapt to unconventional strategies can outweigh superior numbers and resources. In essence, Britain was defeated not only by the Americans, but by the limits of imperial assumptions. In retrospect, historians recognize that the American Revolution was not inevitable, but given the combination of ideological commitment, military innovation, international support, and British miscalculation, the colony's success was highly probable once the conflict escalated. The convergence of these factors underscores the complexity of imperial conflict and the unpredictable nature of human determination in shaping history. Ultimately, the real reason Britain lost the American colonies was the interplay of human, logistical, political, and ideological forces. It was a multifaceted collapse, not a simple defeat. And the consequences of that loss, political, social, and global, reshaped the world, creating a blueprint for future revolutions and establishing the United States as a symbol of what determined people could achieve against overwhelming odds. The story of Britain's loss is more than a military tale, it is a lesson in strategy, leadership, and the limits of power. It reminds us that even the strongest empires can falter when they underestimate the resolve of those they seek to govern, and that the principles of freedom and self-determination can overcome force when people are willing to fight for them. That is why the American Revolution, and Britain's loss, is remembered not just as a historical event, but as a defining moment in the evolution of modern nations. By 1783, the war was over, but its lessons endured. Britain had lost the American colonies, but it had also gained knowledge about the limits of military power, the importance of understanding local populations, and the dangers of ignoring political realities. The empire adapted, focusing on other regions, yet the shadow of the American experience would influence imperial strategy for generations. For the new United States, independence was only the beginning. The colonies had won the war, but they now faced the challenge of building a nation from scratch, creating institutions, balancing state and federal power, and defining the meaning of liberty in practice. The victory gave birth to a country that would become a global symbol of self-determination and democratic ideals, even as it struggled with contradictions and internal conflicts. The real reason Britain lost was never a single mistake or battle. It was the convergence of underestimated local resistance, overextended supply lines, ideological conviction, international intervention, and political miscalculations. The empire's strength was insufficient to overcome the combination of these forces, and the result was a loss that changed the course of history. Britain's defeat and America's triumph reshaped the world. They demonstrated that ideas, resilience, and popular commitment could challenge even the most powerful empires. They showed that military might alone could not secure loyalty or obedience when people were determined to govern themselves. And so, the loss of the American colonies was not just a British failure, it was the beginning of a new era, one defined by the limits of empire, the power of principle, and the enduring human desire for freedom. That is the real story behind Britain's loss, a lesson in strategy, leadership, and the unyielding force of human determination that continues to resonate more than 2 centuries later.